Otherworld Legends is a game about damage. It's designed to be approached from an absolutely offensive perspective. Enemy attacks and movement speed mean most characters will struggle to manage them without killing them quickly. Lethal damage protection makes it impossible to be killed in one interaction, most of the time anyway, making building one's defenses an afterthought, and the overwhelming majority of all buffs are focused on hitting things hard. Some parts of the game are even explicitly designed to only be doable when you deal more than a certain amount of damage. And yet, it's somewhat uncommon for players to understand how damage actually works. Now, unlike other games, Otherworld Legends was, let's say it was programmed, and leave it at that. There are a lot of edge cases and weird jank that isn't properly understood even by the most nerdy members of the community. A lot of interactions are extremely weird, and I'm unsure to what degree Chilleroom intended things to work this way. But in the vast majority of cases, damage in Otherworld Legends is calculated through this general formula. It's important to note that the result of this formula is only rounded visually. The game will still use decimal values for all HP and damage internally. Just about every attack in the game follows this formula or a subset of it. Some attacks don't benefit from damage stats, some don't benefit from damage multipliers, some don't benefit from vulnerability, but if you want to calculate how those work, removing those factors from the equation can do the trick. I'm going to go over each of these factors in detail and explain how they work. Original damage is a very simple concept. Every attack is assigned a value that controls how much damage it deals. It's the reason normal attacks deal less damage than high-power skills when given the same amount of buffs. To see the original damage of an attack, simply remove all buffs from your character and divide the damage by 10, since that will be your damage stat under normal conditions. The original damage is rarely ever modified by anything. Usually the only way to get an attack's original damage to change is by doing something like switching styles, in which case you're essentially using a different attack. It's not something you can build around, but it can help choose what attacks you'll want to use for your builds. This is the easiest factor to see, compare, and calculate with. It just multiplies the damage you deal. If you double your damage stat, you double your damage, period. Now, how the damage stat itself is calculated is more complicated and more interesting, and probably the most useful takeaway from this video. Damage stat in itself, just like every other stat in the game, can be calculated with a simple formula. Note that these are not official terms, so if you see the game referring to base damage stat, they don't mean what I mean here. Unlike the general damage formula I've given, this is completely airtight and has no exceptions. So let's go over what these mean. All stats have a base value. This is the one that is shown on the character select screen before picking them. It is the baseline on which most stat buffs work, and keeps them from growing exponentially. Say for example, if we use Mr. Glass, instead of giving you 50% of your current damage stat, it will only give you 50% of your base amount. So if your base stat is 10, it'll give you 5 damage stat, but if it's 15, it'll give you 7.5. However, if you have a base stat of 10, and use an Amber Munkin to raise your damage stat to 30, equipping Mr. Glass will not give you half of that, it'll still give you 5 damage stat, because your base has not changed. Very few things change your base stats. No items, no Power of Asura, no Realm Soul, none of your typical buffs will improve it. However, weapons will replace whatever base stats you had with the ones the weapon shows. Increasing your base stat is much more powerful than adding more bonuses to it, since most bonuses scale directly off of it. If we go back to our example of 10 base damage with an Amber Munkin and Mr. Glass, 35 damage stat in total, getting a 15 damage weapon would not increase our damage stat by 5 to 40, but rather by 17.5 to 52.5. There are also two things that can multiply your base damage stat. Vesper's Awakened Form and Yoiko's Batojutsu Boon both double it. It should come as no surprise that the only two characters who have this effect happen to be the two best characters in the game. There is one last kind of buff, the ones that add flat amounts of stat and are not affected by your base whatsoever. Notable examples include the plus 5 damage buff from levels, which always gives exactly 5 damage stat no matter what, and Blade of Vampire, which gives a fixed damage amount based on how much HP it drained from you, and maxes out at 30 damage. Damage multipliers do exactly what they sound like they do. Whatever damage you dealt before, it gets multiplied by a set number. They're very simple and easy to understand, and this simplicity also makes them incredibly powerful. This is because all damage multipliers work independently, meaning the damage bonus from one will multiply the damage that has already been multiplied by all the others. So for example, if you're using a ninja cloak for triple damage and an upgraded crowbar for quadruple damage, the ninja cloak will multiply your 1x by 3 for 3x, and then the crowbar will multiply by 4 for 12x. Abusing these items is the key to every one-shot build in the game. It's also relevant that most boons function like this, so in general, boons are additive on themselves and multiplicative with everything else. So if you have a damage boon and an upgraded crowbar, your damage will go from 4x to 4.8x, increasing by 20% of 4, being 0.8. But if you add another damage boon, it will increase by 0.8 again, leaving you with 5.6x damage. If you add a second boon, let's say Hannah's Buff Potency, that increases damage by 50%, it'll increase your damage by 50% of 5.6, which is 2.8. But stacking a second boon will increase it by 2.8 and not grow any further. Now, unfortunately, the damage boon specifically is programmed like shit and can't be expected to behave consistently among every character, despite being a universal boon. So take this example with a grain of salt, but this behavior is how you can expect pretty much every damage-related boon to work. Vulnerability is pretty self-explanatory. However much damage the enemy takes, they will take more. If an enemy has 5 stacks of Embrittled, leading to 50% vulnerability, they will take 50% more damage from attacks. The interesting thing about vulnerability is that, besides a few bizarre exceptions, it increases all damage, since it's simply increasing how much damage the enemy takes, instead of affecting the attacks used to damage them. Much like soul boons, vulnerability sources are additive on themselves but multiplicative with everything else. The vulnerability gained from embrittlement will multiply the one gained from Hunter Dagger, but several stacks of embrittlement will add onto themselves instead of multiplying. It's important to note that damage reduction is basically the same process as vulnerability, but working backwards. If a damage source does not benefit from vulnerability, it's likely it will ignore damage reduction as well. Flat damage sources are incredibly rare. By being so rare, they can generally be disregarded, but I wanted to cover them for the sake of completeness. They work by simply adding a set amount of damage on top of however much damage you're already dealing. The most common example of this is Falcon Emblem, which takes 4% of the enemy's current HP, caps the number at 150, and adds that amount to your attack's damage. However, there are other examples, like Lothair's wound status. The interesting thing about damage that is added flatly is that sometimes it can bypass damage reduction, since the addition is done at the very end of the damage formula. For example, a Falcon Emblem can hit through Tengu's meteors and Iblis's shield, while a wound can deal more than 1 damage to Universal's throne. However, damage reduction and vulnerability are basically two sides of the same coin, so this means these flat sources are rarely buffed by it. So, with all that said, you should have a pretty good baseline understanding of how damage calculation works. Of course, this doesn't cover everything. A lot of attacks have specific extra factors to this formula, things like the number of fire stacks affecting Xilon's fire explosion, that do not fall into one of the categories outlined before. This also doesn't cover how DOT damage is calculated, but given how that's much less relevant and even more janky, I decided to leave it out. So now you should have a good way of making more informed decisions when optimizing your builds. When to go for a flat stat increaser, when to go for a percent increaser, or when to go for damage multipliers and vulnerability. This is the kind of thing that separates a decent L builder from a truly good one. I hope this was helpful.